"You're going to be my spouse one day." He laughed at me, but 15 years later, I came back for him. Isabella Torres planted her feet in sun-bleached sand and dared Cale to take her seriously, though he was older, broader, hair the color of scorched earth, and hands built for breaking horses. The heat made mirages on the horizon, the ranch folding into a shimmering blur, while Mateo's porch chimes tapped a slow, private rhythm. At 12, she spoke like a comet. "You're going to be my spouse one day." He laughed short, incredulous, then returned to the mare as if her vow belonged to the wind. Mesquite whispered secrets, river water winked like a hidden smile, and the late sun carved long shadows that stretched toward promises neither yet understood. Isabella felt something inside rearrange, a small, fierce engine of resolve that would propel her through schoolrooms, city streets, and lonely hotel mirrors. Her mother's announcement of a move felt like a blade. The world narrowed to a single bright obsession. She vowed under a marquee of indifferent stars to become a woman who could stride back into any small town and tilt fate. Cale's laughter stayed with her, like both bruise and map in dreams. His rough hands steadied her. In waking hours, she translated that memory into study, silence, and a ruthless apprenticeship in self-making. The horizon mocked and beckoned in equal measure, a wide place holding both exile and home. When she turned to leave, the air between them crackled, an electric, impossible thing, and the night swallowed his next breath, while the promise remained bright, a lantern against years of dust. Mateo's rough palm against her hair, the smell of prickly pear, and a carved wooden horse handed down through generations stitched themselves into her resolve, until every choice answered that bold, impossible vow. What happened next will shock you. The ranch lay under an unblinking sun, a spread of adobe buildings, splintered fence posts, and scrub that bowed when the wind moved through. Dust braided into hems and boot leather, clinging as if unwilling to let go. Isabella learned that place with the hunger of someone memorizing a map, where shade offered respite at noon, which trough filled last when drought came. How to read a horse's eye for fear. Her grandfather, Mateo, moved among those rhythms like a living atlas, voice low and steady, teaching her to listen to the weather rather than simply watch it. He showed her how to mend a fence without wasting motion, how to find the places where water pooled after a storm, and how to make a small offering before breaking bread. Lessons carried like a slow, valuable inheritance. Cale lived on the ranch's edge, a presence that belonged to open land more than to houses. He was taller than most boys, shoulders already used to labor, hands shaped by tasks that required patience and certainty. When Isabella, at 12, declared beneath a sky thick with indifferent stars that he would be her spouse, his laughter landed like gravel against a window. He laughed partly from disbelief and partly because her insistence belonged to a world of children's certainties. The sound cut and also set something in motion. He moved with a quiet authority around animals, his feet familiar with soft earth, and his look carried a careful amusement that softened his insolence and made that first dismissal linger in Isabella's chest like a bruise that taught her to be harder. The move came carried in Safia's steady voice. "City," she said, and named schools, teachers, and opportunities the ranch could not provide. Her words were practical talismans meant to protect, a map of futures that did not include only fences and harvest. The idea of leaving felt like a small blade slipping under skin, precise and irreversible. Mateo received the news with a mix of pride and a soft grief. He hid behind jokes. He pressed a carved wooden horse into Isabella's hands as if handing over both a family relic and a piece of courage. Neighbors came by to press recipes and old tools into Safia's palms, gestures that tried to fold continuity into an act of departure. On the last night before trunks were sealed, Isabella walked alone to the river. Moonlight braided through cottonwoods, and the current held a silver thread that moved with patient certainty. Cale stood on a flat stone across the bank, 1 foot braced, as if the horizon itself lent him support. She crossed on cold stepping stones, feeling the river nudge her ankles and the world narrow to the simple fact of presence. She did not beg or demand. Instead, she spoke plainly, naming the future she intended to build. Her voice was small beneath the sky, yet firm in its shape. She promised to become someone who could return without shame, someone whose steps carried weight and whose choices repaired rather than discarded. He listened, unmoved at first, then with the brief flicker in his eyes that she would carry like a map. Packing made the home feel like a thing being rewritten. Safia folded shirts with a practical tenderness, smoothing collars as if smoothing a child's anxious weather. Matteo wrapped the wooden horse in oilcloth and tucked a short, crooked note inside. Words that read like a blessing and a question together. The house at dawn felt spacious in the wrong way, corners that had been claimed by habit gaping like small questions. Farewells were steady rather than theatrical. They expressed love through hands that tied bundles and double-checked buckles, the kind of affection that prefers work to words. City life demanded translation. Towers rose where the horizon had been, glass replacing a sky that earlier taught measurement. Isabella kept the carved horse in a pocket of memory and folded her vow into the margins of notebook. Classrooms smelled of chalk and heated steam. Late-night libraries became sanctuaries where she sharpened thought into usable tools. She learned languages, argumentation, mathematics, and the cadence of persuasion. She practiced balance in small gyms and learned to breathe through pressure in ways that shaped both body and intent. In lectures, she learned to anchor an opinion to evidence. In internships, she learned how to make power graceful rather than brush. The city taught her to move like someone who could convert loneliness into study and longing into strategy. Letters became bridges. Cale's handwriting arrived quick and spare, sometimes stopping midline as if chores called the hand away. He wrote about a mare's mood, about a fence that needed mending, about Matteo's jokes and the way the river changed after summer rains. Matteo annotated margins with practical notes: who to call for a broken plow, when to plant a certain seed, and which neighbor's sheep were straying. Safia kept those papers like relics, reading them aloud on evenings when the city felt too large. Those scraps of home threaded into a life otherwise filled with new streets and new demands, a tether for memory that kept the landscape present in nighttime dreams. Years of grinding and polishing Isabella into someone whose edges fit the purpose. She studied late into the night, citing texts and refining the ability to stand her ground in seminar rooms where ideas were tested. In gyms, she learned to move with tactical grace. In internships, she practiced negotiation, learning when to yield and when to hold. Offers of comfort and courtship came in polite lines she declined with the same economy she used to close a book. Each refusal was a stitch reinforcing the vow she carried. Her successes were folded back into that early promise. Every promotion, every new language mastered, felt like a tool saved and sharpened for her eventual return. Through it all, the desert's lessons returned as rituals and memory. Matteo's stories taught humility and a sense of place. The practice of honoring elders through small offerings kept her tethered. On winter nights in the city, she would close her eyes and taste prickly pear, then imagine the hush of stars above Matteo's porch. A boardroom's quiet could fold into the hush of a mesquite wind, and a complex negotiation sometimes resolved into knowing when to listen. Those recollections tempered ambition with patience. Her vow became an organizing compass, steering choices until purpose and origin moved in concert rather than conflict. Sometimes she returned for brief visits, each arrival testing how time had altered land and people. Matteo moved with slower steps, but his eyes brightened when she walked into the corral. Together they worked beneath familiar light, tightening cinches while he taught her to read a horse's breathing and tell fear from fatigue. Apache elders visited with woven cloth and slow songs that braided memory into present tasks. Cale's tribe spoke in careful phrases about land and lineage, and those conversations linked what she had learned in the city to the duties of the place that raised her. Those short returns stitched the city self back to desert roots, reminding Isabella that power without humility would never hold a community's trust, and that vows required deeds as well as ardent promise. Her vow hardened into a compass needle, pointing choices toward a single horizon. Each victory and setback folded back into that original promise, until destiny felt less like fate and more like careful work earned through years of deliberate, unwavering craft. Isabella stepped into the city with a quiet purpose that felt like private scripture. The horizon she had known was replaced by glass and traffic, yet the vow she carried remained unsoftened and became the metric for daily choices. School became a laboratory where patience and precision were forged. Teachers learned that her essays arrived meticulously, arguments cited and footnoted, sentences arranged with a care that read like architecture. At 13, she committed to grammar as if it were posture. At 14, she practiced public speaking in empty lecture halls. And at 15, she refined rhetoric until thought and delivery matched. Each exercise sharpened her intellect into a usable instrument rather than a mere aspiration. Language study became deliberate work that altered perception. Spanish stayed as a warm thread connecting her to the ranch. English opened corridors of commerce and policy. And French taught cadence and restraint that softened bluntness into elegance. She practiced pronunciation in the mirror and rehearsed dialogue until unfamiliar sounds settled into her voice as if they had always belonged. Conversations acquired precision where once she had offered vague answers. She began to present evidence and solutions with calm conviction. The city taught her how to move ideas through rooms and leave them planted in practical soil. Alongside intellectual training, she built physical discipline. Martial arts offered a framework of rhythm and breathing that steadied a heart that could be jolted by memory. A patient instructor taught sequences, counters, and the economy of motion. Repetition turned startling impulses into dependable reactions. Inhale, assess, redirect. Conditioning sessions hardened limbs and gave endurance a steady spine. Regional tournaments offered honest mirrors of progress and places to measure skill against peers. Academics and athletics opened doors to mentorships and internships, where professional mechanisms became visible. In consulting clinics, she learned to analyze budgets, craft persuasive briefs, and present findings to skeptical audiences. Supervisors noticed a seriousness that combined curiosity with strategic patience. They recommended her for summer placements focused on sustainable development and community engagement. Isabella shaped resumes into toolkits and portfolios into promises that could be executed later. Family remained the compass, anchoring all choices. Sophia sent parcels of preserves and embroidered napkins that smelled faintly of home. Mateo's short, weathered notes arrived, folded and practical, containing weather warnings and small jokes that steadied her mind. She read those letters aloud on nights when the city felt too large, letting cadence stitch memory into long hours. Brief returns home tuned her senses. The river's particular pull, the creak of saddle leather, the way animals spoke in a language of smell and movement. Those visits reminded her that authority without rootedness was brittle. Power needed the weight of reciprocal duty. Correspondence with Cale remained sparse but meaningful. His letters arrived between chores and weather, brief accounts of animals, a fence needing repair, and Mateo's stubborn humor. His handwriting was spare, his phrases economical, and the spaces between lines often carried as much meaning as the words themselves. These notes served less as romantic narratives than as calibration points. When vanity or impatience tempted her choices, reading his compact lines returned her to center. City temptations presented themselves in predictable form. Charismatic suitors offered flattering attention, comfortable companionship, and invitations that promised ease. Isabella declined these overtures with practiced courtesy. Her refusals were direct and without spectacle. She learned to set boundaries that preserved freedom and prevented emotional debt. Those who pursued her often mistook distance for indifference. She let misunderstanding function as protection because focus required fewer explanations. Small professional triumphs accumulated into a credible influence. She earned language certifications, ranked highly in regional martial events, and compiled internship projects that demonstrated measurable impact. Colleagues began consulting her for steadier judgment. Mentors opened doors that connected urban expertise with rural needs. Each credential translated into trust she could later convert into effective action near the ranch. Loneliness visited with regularity despite accomplishment. City lights could not replicate the chorus of crickets or Mateo's low laugh. On nights when longing pressed in, she kept the carved wooden horse close and brewed prickly pear tea, letting familiar flavors stitch memory into midnight. Rituals steadied her. A sequence of stretches before bed, a weekly call to her mother, and scheduled visits home that untangled city momentum from origin. Those practices kept the desert's pulse in her chest and prevented momentum from erasing the place that shaped intent. A quiet question threaded through notebooks and occasional speeches. Have you ever held onto a promise that shaped your life? She used that query as a subtle invitation when speaking at panels and in private journals, inviting audiences to inspect their own North Star. Some listeners answered with family duty, others with youthful ambition. But the question turned a solitary vow into communal curiosity and linked private fidelity to shared reflection. A decisive moment came during a summer placement, designing water systems for semi-arid community. Field visits led her to villages whose needs mirrored the ranch's fragile balance. She measured soil, attended community meetings, and learned to translate memory into practical plans. The project paired technical models with patient conversation and taught her that durable solutions must honor custom. Working alongside technicians and village leaders, she learned to shape expertise into service. When a colleague suggested a shortcut, marry into influence, and return with immediate standing, Isabella answered politely and declined. She explained that earned credibility would outlast the advantage gained through convenience. Mentors praised her choice and helped expand projects that blended technical skill with cultural humility, and these experiences transformed ambition into stewardship rather than conquest. A turning point came at a symposium where she presented a pilot plan, linking urban technical resources with rural stewardship. Under stage lights, she spoke of listening to elders and designing systems that honored ritual patterns. Audience members from academic centers and remote towns asked pointed questions. Isabella answered with evidence, and stories gathered on field visits. After the session, an elder pressed a hand to his chest and thanked her for proposing solutions that let community practices persist rather than vanish. That moment confirmed the ethical architecture of her ambition, expertise, married to respect. Successes like this led to invitations to advise cooperative boards, to guest lecture at universities, and to collaborate on infrastructure pilots. Each opportunity expanded her capacity to build durable alliances, and each alliance became another reason to refuse shortcuts that substituted convenience for legitimacy. She kept returning home to relearn the weather and stored each lesson like a tool in a kit. Each success deepened her resolve further. Her destiny felt close, patient, and inevitable.
Isabella arrived at the consulting firm with a quiet gravity that unsettled colleagues accustomed to youthful certainty. She carried earned credentials and a stubborn promise that shaped decisions. On her first day, she learned procedures and hierarchies, but she also introduced a rhythm informed by listening rather than haste. Meetings began with community context, reports emphasized long-term viability, and briefs included voices often excluded. Her supervisors noticed an unusual combination of technical rigor and cultural sensitivity, and they assigned her to projects linking urban expertise with rural resilience. She worked long hours drafting feasibility assessments and modeling water allocation, negotiated with skeptical stakeholders, and learned to translate jargon into questions community members could answer. Each success brought recognition and incremental responsibility. Salaries arrived that converted dreams into practical mobility, enabling travel for field visits and modest investments that seeded later returns. Societal expectations pressed like weather on thin glass. Family acquaintances and casual acquaintances offered paths that glittered with immediate ease, advantageous marriages, social introductions, and comfortable roles that promised stability. Isabella weathered such pressure with the same discipline she applied to study. She declined offers politely, reframed conversations toward her work, and cultivated relationships with mentors who valued competence over pedigree. In boardrooms, men assumed she would prioritize family sooner than projects. She answered with evidence and timelines, demonstrating how investment in expertise yielded broader benefits. Still, whispers prowled in corridors and comments slipped into public gatherings. She learned to convert gossip into fuel for refinement, letting indignities refine rather than derail resolve. Mateo's letters arrived, A line about goats, a note about a fence, a joke about a stubborn mule. Each page bore the slow patience of home and threaded longing into practice. He described Cale with a restrained warmth that carried distance and affection, noting changes without melodrama. Cale had grown into leadership within his community, taking responsibilities that reshaped his days. News filtered through that Cale had married a woman from a neighboring family, then later separated, and the brief domestic chapter had left him more solitary and reflective. Mateo's descriptions never aimed to dramatize. They offered particulars: how Cale walked at dawn, the way he consulted elders before decisions, the steady cadence of his labor that sketched a man who bore public duty lightly, but bore private scars with quiet endurance. Those updates stitched into Isabella's days like a background hum, both easing and complicating longing, confirming that life carried its own negotiations, and that promises matured into different shapes as people changed. At the firm, Isabella faced ethical dilemmas that demanded the blend of competence and humility she had cultivated. She encountered proposals that prioritized short-term visibility over sustainable outcomes, flashy interventions that would please donors but undercut local practice, consultant recommendations that ignored seasonal patterns, and funding allocations that overlooked custodial tradition. Her role required steady negotiation, reframing metrics to reflect communal values, setting pilot phases that allowed iteration, and insisting on listening tours before plans were finalized. These choices sometimes alienated colleagues who sought rapid wins, and they occasionally delayed recognition, yet they preserved credibility and built durable partnerships that would later be essential when she planned her return. Outside the office, she continued martial practice, not as spectacle but as maintenance, breathwork and reflex training that kept responses measured and posture unyielding. Training taught an economy of motion that complemented strategic thinking, to conserve energy until a precise moment, to redirect force instead of meeting it head-on, to step aside in order to control the center. Those lessons translated into negotiation tactics and public presence. A steady breath could settle an anxious board. A precise movement in demonstration could shift a community discussion. Offers of romance surfaced with predictable cadence. Invitations to dinners, polite courtship rituals, and proposals couched in friendly futurity. Each came with a cost calculation that Isabella made silently. Did this advance agency or dilute purpose? She refused with courtesy, valuing partnerships that would later be mutual and supportive rather than expedient. Her network grew in professional circles that valued long-term engagement, and she built allies who shared an ethic of service and a preference for durable solutions. A critical moment arrived when senior partners debated a fast-track plan to consolidate influence through a high-profile partnership with local elites, offering immediate status but undermining community autonomy. Isabella spoke plainly, presenting evidence from field visits and offering an alternative that phased engagement and prioritized local governance. Her argument rested on data and deference. She proposed pilot projects co-designed with elders, transparent funding mechanisms, and sunset clauses to prevent dependency. The board listened. Some skeptics remained, but they approved a pilot that preserved community voice. That small victory rippled outward. The firm invited her to lead similar initiatives and recognized the value of integrating cultural humility into technical expertise. With increased responsibility came new scrutiny. Some colleagues resented her assent and hinted that her loyalty to remote obligations made her less committed to urban client bases. She addressed such critiques by producing rigorous deliverables and inviting critics to observe pilots in situ, converting skepticism into evidence. On a winter return home, she found Mateo slower but spirit intact. They repaired fences together, and she taught local students basic water management principles in a sunlit hall. The villagers asked sharp questions and offered practical wisdom. Their curiosity sharpened her proposals and grounded models in lived experience. Cale appeared in fragments across these visits, overseeing seasonal work, mediating disputes, and offering a terse observation now and then about weather or life. These moments were distant and textured, never dramatic. They suggested steadiness, responsibility, and a life arranged around duty rather than spectacle. Despite distance, their exchanges deepened in quiet ways: shared respect for land practices, mutual attention to community priorities, and an understanding that leadership often required sacrifice without applause. Isabella's finances allowed discreet investments in local infrastructure, wells repaired, seed banks supported, and educational resources funded through community committees rather than public announcements. She preferred anonymity, convinced that legitimacy required consent rather than charity. She worked through local leaders and ensured projects reflected community priority. That restraint built trust and reduced friction. When her name surfaced, people respected the support that arrived without fanfare. Still, personal sacrifices were endured. She missed easy laughter and casual companionship, and she sometimes wondered whether unrelenting focus had cost small joy. Those doubts arrived as questions she welcomed. What drives you to keep going despite obstacles? She posed the query privately and publicly at gatherings, inviting reflection from peers and audiences, and used responses to calibrate her work. Answers varied: obligation, unfinished vows, a desire to effect change, and those conversations deepened her sense of purpose while humanizing the costs involved. Months folded into years, and her reputation became quiet, substantive, a professional who balanced technical acumen with a principled approach to cultural stewardship. Her trajectory prepared her for more consequential choices, equipping her with tools to lead ethically and with heartwarming attention to those whose lives would be altered by policy. Through each challenge, she maintained a private compass that pointed toward a single horizon: return not as conqueror but as partner, carrying resources earned through work and trust engendered through respectful engagement.
Isabella returned to the desert as a figure whose presence recalibrated expectations. Between 21 and 25, she transformed ambition into institutions and private resolve into public service. During that stretch, she founded enterprises that addressed sustainable agriculture, water governance, bilingual education, and cultural preservation, designing each venture so that profit reinforced rather than replaced local authority. Her leadership teams paired engineers with elders, economists with community councils, and educators with traditional artisans, ensuring projects honored place as much as performance. Fluent in 7 languages, she convened meetings in Spanish, English, French, and the tongues of nearby communities, bridging lexicons so that meaning did not erode in translation. She insisted that every initiative begin with a listening tour, require locally controlled governance, and include sunset clauses that prevented dependency on outside capital. Technical models incorporated ceremonial calendars and seasonal patterns, so irrigation schedules respected harvest rituals and avoided interference with meaningful practices. Scholars and practitioners partnered to translate manuals into native languages and train apprentices to maintain equipment, creating pathways for succession grounded in local knowledge. Her insistence on transparency produced independent evaluations and public reporting, which transformed skeptical observers into collaborators after they witnessed measurable benefit. Success brought visibility and interrogation. Journalists wrote profiles while critics labeled her approaches experimental, questioning whether blending tradition with modernity compromised rigor. She welcomed scrutiny and responded with structural remedies, external audits, community advisory boards, and open field days where methodologies were presented in full rather than as polished summary. Those measures converted opponents into cautious allies and strengthened institutional credibility across regions that had long suffered top-down intervention. Her financial gains funded a foundation named for Mateo, which prioritized bilingual curricula, elder stewardship programs, and apprenticeships that combined vocational technique with governance training. That foundation awarded fellowships to local leaders and sponsored exchange visits so communities could observe peer projects rather than rely solely on external consultants. Isabella remained personally restrained in public celebrations and preferred visiting sites quietly, letting work speak in stabilized livelihoods rather than in grand announcements. Regular returns to the ranch grounded her decisions. She repaired fences with Mateo, listened to elders who taught land cycles, and taught students practical maintenance in sunlit workshops. Those visits reminded her that legitimacy required consent, that authority without reciprocity fractured quickly, and that durable change depended on shared stewardship. Private news about KL arrived through Mateo and through tribal channels,
painting a portrait of a man who had assumed leadership responsibilities and carried private burdens with understated steadiness. Reports noted a marriage that later dissolved. The separation was not dramatic but procedural, born of mismatched obligations and the long arc of communal duty that left little room for private reconciliation. Knowing this, Isabella felt hope without certainty, a seriousness that balanced desire with attention to context. His solitude suggested both opening and caution at once. She turned resources toward pragmatic support rather than symbolic gestures, financing water sensors and training committees to interpret data so communities could negotiate from evidence. During a severe dry season, she directed emergency funds to install a participatory monitoring network that paired simple sensors with local committees, trained to assess readings and coordinate responses. That network reduced conflict over scarce allocations because transparent information enabled negotiation from fact rather than rumor, and committees acquired authority to act quickly when thresholds were breached. Engineers adapted models in response to community feedback, and elders provided calendars that informed planting and resting cycles, producing measurable improvements in yields and social cohesion. She deliberately avoided charity theater. Investments were routed through cooperatives and community trusts, so that benefits accrued to collective accounts under local oversight. Young local leaders advanced through apprenticeships she sponsored. They learned bureaucracy and machinery and practiced mediation, so governance could be handed forward with competence. In urban forums, she articulated principles that made funding contingent on shared governance and cultural preservation, persuading donors that sustainability required power redistribution rather than unilateral control. Her rhetorical skill proved persuasive because it matched practice. She could cite comparative data, explain field mechanics, and read a ceremonial schedule with the same fluency as a balance sheet. Professional accolades accumulated, but she treated them as instruments rather than ends, redirecting awards into endowments and using visibility to spotlight grassroots voices rather than elevate her own image. Personal sacrifices persisted. She missed easy intimacy, unscheduled laughter, and mornings when tasks were small and sunlight abundant, rather than scheduled and strategic. Solitude weighed on her. Nights alone often found her with Mateo's carved wooden horse in hand, tasting prickly pear tea and tracing plans for governance, rather than settling into domestic ease. Nevertheless, she framed sacrifice as investment in intergenerational goods, believing that discipline and delayed gratification would yield community agency sustained beyond her tenure. Her public questions became tools for reflection. In speeches and panels, she asked peers and audiences, "What is the one goal you would sacrifice everything for?" naming purpose as the lodestar for choice. That invitation functioned as a mirror and a provocation, eliciting answers about family, justice, art, and collective uplift, and prompting listeners to reckon with costs and commitment. At a symposium, she presented a pilot that linked urban technical resources with rural stewardship, explaining how measurement and ceremony could coexist, and how local control improved outcome. After the presentation, an elder approached, pressing a hand to his chest and thanking her for proposing solutions that conserved ritual while addressing scarcity, a moment that confirmed ethical alignment. Her reputation at 25 combined capacity with restraint, capital that converted into durable institutions, networks that enabled translation between worlds, and a record of projects that respected. She invested discreetly, preferring anonymous grants routed through community committees and supporting educational programs without public fanfare, so legitimacy remained rooted in consent. When news of these efforts reached Kale, he observed from a distance with curiosity and caution. His response was measured, shaped by years of duty and an appreciation for action over announcement. Their interactions remained deliberate and unhurried, gestures exchanged in shared work rather than performative scenes, both of them learning that rebuilding required patience and shared responsibility. Isabella's trajectory did not aim at conquest but at partnership. Her readiness combined resources, relationships, and humility, so that any return could be a rebuilding rather than an imposition. By consolidating institutions that balanced tradition with technical capacity, she prepared a return grounded in legitimacy, ready to engage in joint decisions and shared futures, rather than singular triumph. Her influence became a quiet force of nature, energetic yet disciplined, strong enough to alter systems and soft enough to respect the rhythms that had raised her. Destiny watched while she worked, and in that patient waiting, her plans matured into a readiness that favored mutual respect above spectacle. Communities began to reference her work when settling disputes, citing protocols her teams had co-created as precedents that protected rights and livelihoods. Elders who once greeted proposals with skepticism now sat on advisory councils and recommended apprentices for leadership roles, a testament to trust earned over time. Those quiet endorsements mattered more than any gala or headline because they guaranteed that structures would endure when she stepped back and allowed local governance.
Isabella returned to the borderlands with purpose sharpened into deliberate design, buying a hacienda that rose on a gentle ridge where mesquite met cultivated plots and where whitewashed walls caught the low light of evening. The acquisition was conducted through trusted intermediaries who respected privacy because she intended curiosity to spread organically rather than through announcement. The estate's terraces overlooked Mateo's land, close enough for easy visits, yet positioned to spark speculation about the identity of its new owner. She preferred that questions circulate in marketplaces and porches, that rumor performed the initial work of social investigation, while community voices processed change on their own terms. Anonymous philanthropy became her chosen method of introduction. Rather than claiming credit, she funneled resources through local committees and cooperative trusts. Watersheds received careful rehabilitation projects co-designed with elders, improving catchment capacity while honoring seasonal rituals that guided planting cycles. Artisans found support through small grants, apprenticing youth to traditional craft, while workshops incorporated business skills that ensured economic continuity. A modest clinic gained equipment and training programs delivered by technicians who consulted directly with community representatives, avoiding hierarchical imposition. Her deposits into community accounts came with clear governance protocols, sunset clauses, and participatory monitoring, so decisions remained local and transparent. Those structures converted assistance into capacity building, and slowly skepticism shifted toward cautious appreciation as people witnessed tangible improvements. In tandem with practical investments, Isabella staged a cultural choreography that would culminate at San Miguel, aligning timing and visibility to maximize local agency. San Miguel's festival had always concentrated attention in the town center with processions, music, ritual prayers and markets that filled dusty lanes with color. She funded festival logistics through municipal partners, insisted that performances represent diverse neighborhoods, and prioritized inclusive seating so ordinary families would not be excluded. Local youth were employed as stewards and safety personnel, receiving stipends and training that translated into subsequent job opportunities during routine civic events. She requested that elders select ceremonial colors and approve patterns for banners, so symbolism remained rooted in collective tradition rather than external design. Tailors and weavers were engaged early, producing garments that fused ancestral motifs with contemporary stitches, ensuring that ceremony would honor lineage and craft. Behind the practical measures, she composed private preparations, asking Mateo to recount family constellations and river stories, while she rehearsed restraint and ceremonial gestures. Those nightly sessions deepened her sense of humility, reminding her that presence at the festival should communicate deference and partnership rather than spectacle. She commissioned a dress with gold embroidery and deep blue silk, colors chosen after consultations with elders who explained their ritual resonance and properly contextualized hue and pattern. The garment combined tradition and finery, hand-stitched motifs that echoed ancestral symbols, a silhouette that allowed movement across courtyards, and fabrics resilient enough for desert wind. In commissioning the dress, she worked through local ateliers, insisting that labor and skill be sourced from the region so that visible beauty yielded economic benefit. Rumor and memory braided into gossip about Cale as details circulated. Mateo reported that Cale's duties had matured into leadership, his days filled with mediation, early rituals and seasonal demands.
News arrived in measured lines from the ranch. Cale had married and later separated, the episode quiet and procedural, yet reflective of complex obligations rather than personal failing. Mateo mentioned dreams Cale shared in private, descriptions of a girl who once promised impossible things beneath a wide sky, images that suggested both longing and the weight of responsibility. Such intimations moved through community channels and softened initial suspicion, turning questions about the mysterious benefactor into conversations about history, duty, and fate. Isabella used timing strategically, allowing curiosity to swell until attention peaked during the festival, when communal eyes and ears would naturally focus on public ritual. Preparations in town produced a tactile electricity, market stalls overflowed with peppers and woven baskets, children rehearsed dances beneath bunting, and elders exchanged measured gossip while fans stirred air. Night rehearsals echoed in plazas, the scent of stews braided with lantern oil and incense, as tailors finished hems and cooks calibrated community recipes. The hacienda hummed with activity too. Kitchens prepared provisions for workers, carpenters secured stages, and artisans fastened finishing motifs to ceremonial banners. Mateo appeared more brittle in movement, but his eyes brightened when she arrived, and together they inspected terraces, adjusted irrigation, and mended fences in routines that stitched return into habit. Visits to elders and tribal councils became formal dialogues. She presented project reports, listened to critiques, accepted suggested amendments, and revised plans to reflect collective priorities. Her approach emphasized reciprocity. Rather than imposing timelines, she offered technical assistance contingent on community ratification, deferring to local calendars and rituals. Private advisors cautioned that anonymity might frustrate some donors and diminish profile, but she valued legitimacy over applause and preferred that work ripple outward organically. Speculation about the blonde woman hardened into narratives that mixed admiration with suspicion, debating motives and suggesting stories that sometimes exaggerated her resources or intent. Through it all, she cultivated restraint in public appearances, practicing measured steps, greeting elders with humility, and avoiding ostentatious displays that might alienate stakeholders. The dress, when completed, combined ceremonial resonances with a modern cut that enabled movement and signaled respect without assertion, a garment designed for ritual rather than spectacle. She rehearsed arrival sequences with community stewards so that logistics supported inclusion and minimized hierarchical separation between guests and residents. Security plans prioritized local employment and transparency so that the presence felt communal rather than foreign, and volunteers from nearby towns were briefed to act in service rather than dominance. As festival day approached, the town pulsed with an anticipatory rhythm, stalls multiplied, music rehearsed, and the air filled with expectation that a story would unfold beneath lantern light. Isabella waited at dawn beneath a sky that held both heat and the promise of rain, thinking through each gesture and pledge, committed to enter as partner rather than patron and to let community voice shape the encounter. She knew that strategy required patience and humility, that true re-entry demanded listening first and revealing intent gradually, and that any reunion with Cale should honor communal processes as much as private promises. Her preparations were strategic and electrifying, not for spectacle but because they calibrated curiosity into communal readiness, aligning resources, ritual, and relationship so that return could begin on terms of shared dignity. On festival morning, Isabella felt a hush that resembled prayer, an inward steadying not born of fear but of respect, for she understood that re-entry demanded patient reciprocity. Artisans tightened glittering stitches, elders arranged offerings and council members rehearsed invocations, and she used those hours to rehearse humility, to shape each greeting into an honest question, to ensure any reunion with Cale would unfold within communal process rather than private drama, promising herself that she would enter as partner, listen first, accept correction, and let shared authority decide what next steps would look like. trusting that when two lives met again the soil itself would testify whether destiny had been earned or merely imagined, and she trusted that time and service would reveal whether the vow remained true or had changed shape years.
Isabella stepped from the hacienda carriage into a courtyard braided with lantern light, the San Miguel Festival blooming around her, as if the town had been holding its breath for a single moment to decide fate. A dress captured the lamps and turned each shimmer into deliberate motion. Gold embroidery threaded through deep blue silk, a silhouette that suggested both ceremony and ease as the hem whispered along worn flagstones. Children paused mid-run and pointed with wide mouths. Elders inclined their heads and murmured over memories, while merchants adjusted awnings to let woven banners catch the evening wind. Musicians hesitated, then resumed, the first notes like a pulse that moved through the crowd and stitched attention into a single seam. Cal stood at the churchyard edge beneath a weathered arch, hands eased into the folds of a wool poncho, the years etched into his shoulders, and the slow composure of a man tempered by duty. Lantern light freckled his cheekbones, and the profile of a leader who had softened over seasons into measured silence, a silence that contained responsibility and careful restraint. When Isabella entered his sightline, the plaza narrowed to the simple geometry of two bodies aligned by memory, and something in Cale's chest unclenched in recognition that was both startling and inevitable. Time did not behave like a straight line for them. It folded and overlapped so that the child who had promised and the adult who had kept obligations touched like pages in a ledger laid open. She moved with the authority of someone who had rehearsed restraint and generosity in equal measure, each step a choice meant to honor both self and community. He rose to meet her because etiquette and instinct demanded it, his gait steady, his eyes measuring without the spectacle, and in that careful approach, the plaza seemed to quiet in deference. The first words between them were not grand declarations but careful calibrations, sentences exchanged with the chemistry of people accustomed to making decisions that affected many lives. Cale's voice was low and roughened by sun and wind when he said, "I never forgot," and the phrase landed like a soft rain on both of them, dissolving the gravel of years into something fertile. She listened without dramatics, letting the admission settle into the space between heartbeats where memory and desire negotiate terms. He spoke of nights spent waking to the river's sound, and of council meetings that demanded moral choices, of marriage entered with hope that later reshaped into responsible distance, of a solitude adopted as a companion to duty. Isabella answered with accounts of libraries that smelled of dust and possibility, of contracts negotiated and companies founded with humility, as a policy rather than a slogan, of evenings when the carved wooden horse rode in her hands and steadied longing. The crowd became background like a painting receding, its colors softening while the central image sharpened into that private conversation beneath lanterns and stars. During a lull in prayers, an elder called a blessing, and the plaza responded with a hush that turned ordinary breath into a ritual offering. They walked toward the riverbank where shadow and water met, where cottonwoods filtered light and the current kept a private cadence known only to those who listened often enough. Isabella removed a shawl and draped it about her shoulders as if arranging a small concession to modesty and to tradition. Cale nodded with the quiet courtesy of a man who had learned when to show deference. She repeated the childhood vow in a voice softened by experience. "I told you I'd come back," and hearing those words again seemed to rearrange the night so that past promise and present proof overlapped. Cale's laughter this time was not derisive but startled, a sound that carried relief and an unguarded joy that surprised him as much as it surprised the listeners nearby. He admitted he had carried the echo of her words through difficult seasons, and that the memory had shaped choices more than he expected, that sometimes a small promise acts like a compass when larger duties threaten to unmoor one's life. Isabella listened and then spoke of intent and method. She described projects funded through local trusts, wells repaired under community governance, and apprenticeships she had seeded so youth could claim craft and leadership without outsiders dictating terms. They discussed repairs and rituals with equal gravity, resolving that any joint future would begin with public consultation and shared oversight rather than private declarations detached from collective consent. The festival swelled around them with dances that traced lineage and with drums that reaffirmed communal pulse, and in that sound they found a rhythm that could hold both personal longing
and social responsibility. An elder stepped close and pressed a palm to both their brows in a blessing practiced across generations, sealing a public acknowledgement that marriage between individuals must also honor wider kin and land. In that blessing, Kale and Isabella felt a careful humility wash over them, an understanding that love in that place required reciprocity and that vows could not be divorced from service. They spoke about small practicalities then: timing for meetings, the composition of advisory committees, how seed banks would be administered, and how festivals would fund apprenticeships, each mundane planning item a scaffolding for future partnership. Between plans they allowed laughter, tender and sudden, the sort that forms when people remember how small gestures once felt epic, and how grown choices could still surprise with sweetness. Later, as lanterns rose into the sky like a constellation given breath, Isabella and Kale paused beneath a cottonwood and let gravity do the rest. Proximity, a quiet hand touching a shoulder, a forehead met with a palm in an old benediction. Kale offered a small ring of silver and turquoise that he had carried in a pocket for months, a loop small enough to fit into a backstory and large enough to hold in. And he spoke a phrase that sounded like both apology and promise. "I kept it until now because I needed to know I could give it responsibility." She accepted with a nod that bore the weight of negotiation, of consent given after evidence of readiness, not because romance demanded haste, but because tradition required mutual capability. The river reflected lanterns and their faces, making the surface a map of two lives reflected and refracted, and the town watched with an attention that felt like a gentle witness rather than a voyeuristic hunger. Children collected fallen flowers to braid into small crowns, while elders nodded in ways that indicated approval and a cautious hope that this joining could strengthen communal bonds rather than disrupt them. Musicians resumed and the night reopened into festivity, but Isabella and Kale remained tethered to the alcove where they had made arrangements with humility and shared intent. They tested logistics for a joint venture they sketched on a scrap of paper, a cooperative managed by locals with technical support from her foundation, seed distribution timed according to ceremonial calendars, and a rotating council to ensure decisions stayed proximate to those affected. Kale surprised her with a private admission about fear. Sometimes responsibility had required him to silence personal longing to avoid burdening community resources, and the confession landed as a soft truth neither had voiced before. She answered with pragmatic tenderness, promising accountability and insisting that partnership meant shared burdens rather than unilateral sacrifice. The exchange shifted their roles subtly. He who had been steady with land learned to accept external resources rooted in consent, and she who had been a builder learned to slow with local rhythm and depth. As the festival peaked, they walked back to the plaza hand in hand with a publicness that was not spectacle but visible agreement, and applause rose not because they had staged a scene but because the community perceived mutual respect and durability. Later, under a sky washed in stars, they stood where a younger Isabella once had dared a declaration, and now both understood how time had folded the impossible into practiced care. Kale said quietly that he had once laughed to protect himself from appearing vulnerable, and that her return had undone a defense he did not know he needed to lower. Isabella responded by naming the many small labors she had undertaken: nights negotiating contracts, mornings teaching apprentices, afternoons repairing fences when visiting home, each act a stitch in a fabric meant to hold more than two hearts. They promised then to build a life that mirrored those labors: public projects that honored ritual, private rooms that held laughter and rest, and governance structures that prevented unilateral decisions and ensured accountability. The night allowed them a brief private kiss that felt like a gentle settling rather than a feverish claim, and the plaza accepted it as another note in a communal song rather than a final curtain. As festivities waned, families drifted toward hearths, and Isabella walked with Kale back toward the terraces where her hacienda rose, lanterns reflecting on tiled roofs and the river whispering continuity. He walked her to the threshold and paused, hand on the carved wooden horse she always carried. He touched the small carving tenderly and said, "Your promise changed how I decided, and in that change I found reason to." She smiled, the expression steady and luminous, and answered simply, "I told you I'd come back, and now we will decide together what that return becomes." In that mutual sentence, the story did not end, but began an elaboration of shared work, public service and private care, and the town slept with the comfort that two lives had negotiated terms that honored history, duty, and desire. Then Cal stepped forward, offering a small turquoise ring as a sign of intent and communal respect and responsibility.
Isabella returned to the ranch under a sky brushed with late light, aware that curiosity and measured caution would follow every step. She had learned to let work announce intent rather than names. Repairs and training programs arrived through community committees and cooperative accounts, so benefits belonged to residents instead of a single sponsor. Wells received filtration upgrades co-managed by elders and apprentices. Seed stores opened with community oversight, and apprenticeships paired young learners with master craftspeople whose memory preserved practical lore. A clinic obtained supplies through a trust, and a modest fund supported teacher stipends, arrangements that made material assistance feel like shared investment rather than fleeting charity. When a sandstorm rose weeks later, ripping tiles from roofs and filling cisterns with grit, fragile goodwill was tested. Isabella moved among families carrying sacks and tools procured from regional markets, but she let local masons and weavers lead repairs so the work remained the town's work. She organized training cohorts that taught roof mending, water filtration, and cooperative bookkeeping. Apprentices practiced under elders' supervision until skill and memory braided together and repair became both craft and tradition. At the river where she had once declared a childish vow, Isabella and Cal convened assemblies to rehearse cooperative governance. Role-plays simulated drought allocations. Elders helped translate ceremonial calendars into practical schedules, and technicians demonstrated how simple sensors and shared ledgers reduced ambiguity during scarcity. Negotiation exercises revealed fault lines, conflicting recollections of previous projects, language gaps between generations, and fears of dependency, and the team revised plans to embed safeguards, transparency, and local decision gates. A pivotal moment arrived when Lila, Cal's former spouse, attended a council meeting and asked blunt questions about fairness. Her presence could have reopened private wounds, yet Isabella answered with humility and concrete proposals. An independent audit, a joint oversight board with rotating membership, and dispute resolution mediated by elders. She invited Lila to help design grievance mechanisms, and inclusion shifted suspicion into participation, as community members witnessed former adversaries shaping practical remedies. Over months, shared labor became ritualized. Mornings repaired terraces and cisterns, afternoons hosted apprenticeship workshops and technical training. Evenings convened councils that mixed prayer with planning. Children who once eyed strangers warily fetched tools and carried messages for elders. Elders taught memory songs about irrigation sequences, and apprentices recited technical steps alongside verse. So teaching embodied both accuracy and lineage. Festival proceeds funded maintenance and apprenticeships, a knitting celebration with responsibility. So public joy sustained public goods. When a drought tested reserves that spring, the participatory systems proved their worth. Simple sensors placed in cisterns produced readings posted at the plaza. Each morning, committees interpreted data against ceremonial markers and agreed on equitable rotation. Because rules were transparent and decisions anchored to elders' calendars, disputes diminished. Choices rested on shared information and ritual timing rather than rumor. Isabella coordinated discrete technical assistance through local accounts and mentored committees in monitoring techniques so young leaders could interpret readings and convene negotiations without external intermediaries. Cal and Isabella's relationship matured alongside institutional reform. They met daily to review minutes, discuss seed inventories, and plan apprenticeship graduations rather than to recite private vows. Tender gestures appeared in small acts, a shared cup of coffee at dawn, hands tightening a hinge together, but the backbone of their partnership became reciprocal governance and cooperative labor. In public, they modeled collaborative leadership. Cal convened elders and honored protocol, while Isabella translated technical details into accessible plans and invited critique, and together they accepted correction as part of accountable stewardship. A turning point came when the community proposed a festival to celebrate apprenticeships and inaugurate a seed bank. Instead of staging a donor spectacle, they designed an event centered on collaborative work.
Elders led sunrise blessings, apprentices demonstrated terrace repairs, technicians presented water tests, and families contributed dishes for a communal meal. At the festival, Isabella and Cal announced a scholarship program, administered by a rotating board funded through cooperative proceeds, a decision that reinforced local ownership and signaled that opportunity would circulate through community channels. As seasons passed, practical outcomes accumulated. Yields stabilized because seed rotations respected ancestral calendars, wells ran clearer thanks to participatory filtration systems, and youth secured livelihoods through apprenticeships, combining craft and governance training. Neighboring communities adopted portions of the trust model, sending delegations to observe assemblies and adapt protocols to local rites. And Isabella channeled visibility into training materials and exchange visits, so knowledge traveled with consent rather than imposition. By the river where cottonwoods filtered light, Cal proposed with a simple silver band inlaid with turquoise, kneeling not to claim possession, but to ask for a partnership, grounded in shared labor, mutual accountability, and public consent. His words echoed the community's rhythm. Proposals presented, discussed and ratified rather than declared behind closed doors. Isabella accepted with care, understanding that marriage here meant entering governance with clear responsibilities and collective oversight. After the ceremony, the plaza hummed with laughter and small satisfactions. Children wove garlands, artisans sold tokens reflecting apprentices' craft, and neighbors shared plates of food prepared by many hands. Suspicion softened into shared responsibility, and communal resilience strengthened, because decisions were embedded in daily practice rather than allocated by a distant benefactor. Isabella watched younger leaders step forward and felt belonging grow from reciprocal trust rather than from charity. At the ceremony, she posed a gentle question that spread into hearths and council rooms. Where do you feel you truly belong? The prompt threaded conversations through markets and meetings, inviting neighbors to name the commitments and duties that bound them to play. Answers varied: family, landscape, shared labor, but the collective reflection underscored how belonging flourishes when responsibilities are mutual and when identity expresses itself through service. In subsequent months, the structures they had built endured because they rested on routine, transparent meetings, rotating oversight, apprenticeship training in both skill and governance, festivals renewing memory while funding future work. Isabella and Cal's partnership became a living model of mutual accountability, demonstrating that vows braided with humility and labor can fortify communities long after headlines fade, and that sustained service and shared authority create durable belonging and.
The wedding unfolded at Mateo's ranch, beneath an open sky that seemed to approve with steady light. Courtyards filled with neighbors, elders, apprentices, and distant colleagues, who had learned to translate technical plans into community practice. Woven banners stirred from mesquite limbs, while drums kept a measured pulse that drew attention into a shared rhythm. Isabella entered with composed steps, her dress blended ancestral embroidery with practical tailoring, so that pattern and posture spoke of respect and method rather than show. Guests rose in a hush that felt less like spectacle and more like witness. Elders led ritual songs tied to river calendars, neighbors left small offerings to honor ancestors, and the couple moved through those motions with deliberate humility. Rings were exchanged, silver set with turquoise and etched with river motifs, chosen after council, so jewelry held both lineage and promise. Vows were spoken in public language, commitments to shared labor, accountability and governance rather than private possession. When an elder blessed the union, the plaza inhaled as one, and the blessing felt like a contract between lives and land. After the ceremony, apprentices demonstrated terrace repairs and technicians displayed simple sensor readings that tracked cistern levels, evidence made public so decisions could rest on data rather than rumor. Children presented bilingual posters, explaining how seed rotations followed ancestral calendars adjusted by empirical measures. The demonstrations felt like proof. Tools combined with tradition reduced conflict and allocated resources equitably. Neighbors nodded as technicians explained maintenance routines and elders validated timing with stories that stitched ritual into practice. Meals stretched along long tables, where neighbors passed dishes combining ancestral recipes and produce from supported gardens. Conversations moved seamlessly from congratulations to planning, and moments of celebration turned into commitments to future stewardship. Invitations to apprentice graduations and seed bank meetings circulated like further blessings rather than administrative obligation. Laughter threaded through planning conversations, and small agreements: who would oversee the next seed distribution, which elder would chair a rotating board, felt as meaningful as vows. In the weeks that followed, Isabella established a foundation focused on preserving Apache culture, while supporting locally led development. The charter prioritized consent, rotating oversight, and transparent reporting. Microgrants, funded apprenticeships, bilingual education, and artisan cooperative funds were routed through cooperative trusts, administered by councils combining elders, elected young leaders, and technical advisors, so authority remained local and decisions public. Governance protocols required community ratification of major expenditures and sunset clauses on sponsored initiatives. Kale retained tribal responsibilities while assuming co-chair roles on joint councils. Lila joined oversight boards to ensure transitions honored precedent and reform. Their collaboration turned private history into governance capacity, transforming relational complexity into institutional advantage. Committees argued over seed rotation rules and audit schedules, and those debates strengthened systems because disagreement occurred within established protocols rather than through rumor. Public deliberation normalized dispute resolution and made transparency habitual. Programs produced measurable outcomes. Seed banks stabilized supplies, yields improved as rotations honored ancestral timing and empirical checks, and apprentices secured livelihoods, maintaining terraces, filtration systems, and cooperative ledger. Neighboring communities requested training visits and adapted elements of the trust model, carrying practices as living gifts rather than prescriptive templates. Delegations returned home with context-sensitive adjustments that fit local rites and calendar. Daily rhythms wove governance into life. Mornings began with quick briefings by the river, where cottonwoods filtered light. Afternoons were for workshop visits, and evenings convened problem-solving sessions that mixed prayer with logistics. When drought pressed, cistern censors posted results in the plaza each dawn, and committees interpreted readings against ceremonial markers to agree on rotations that kept water flowing equitably. Because rules were transparent, disputes diminished, and management was normalized into routine practice. Mateo's final years became a communal celebration as apprentices recalled his lessons about fence mending and seed saving. At his passing, the town gathered, sang ancestral songs, and placed his carved wooden horse in a heritage room, managed by the foundation as a symbol of stewardship and memory. His stories were retold by children who had apprenticed under him, and his practical jokes lived on as teaching moments in workshops. Isabella and Kale's partnership attracted study visits from distant organizations impressed by routine durability rather than headline. Critics who feared outside influence found concerns eased because local ratification was required for fun. The foundation published reports, accompanied by local testimonies, and hosted field days where neighbors could inspect projects, ask questions, and vote on priorities, ensuring accountability remained an everyday practice, rather than occasional theater. The couple threaded public work into private care. They argued about tactics, but returned to protocols that kept decisions proximate. He convened elders and honored a ceremony while she translated technical details into accessible plans and invited critique. Their relationship modeled partnership, shared labor, mutual accountability, and an insistence that vows be enacted through service rather than rhetoric. Small gestures, kneading dough at a communal meal, tightening a hinge on a community gate, became meaningful practices of marriage lived in public. Isabella moved her company's regional office to the town, converting an administrative suite into a training center where elders and technicians co-led workshops. Local hires filled clerical roles, apprentices managed equipment and maintenance teams, artisans formed cooperatives marketing crafts beyond the region, with proceeds returning to community trust. Microloans scaled workshops and visitor programs, honored cultural protocols while generating income that stayed local. Economic shifts prioritized capacity building and sustained livelihood. During the ceremony, Lila stepped forward, offering a blessing that acknowledged history and endorsed a future negotiated in common terms. Her words turned past tensions into public commitment and signaled that healed relationships could strengthen governance. Neighbors later named that blessing the day's heart, because inclusion became practice rather than speech. The foundation published annual audits alongside testimonies and hosted field days where citizens inspected projects, asked questions, and voted on priority. Dispute procedures and rotating oversight became models neighboring councils adapted, sending delegations to observe and return with context-sensitive variation. Apprentices graduated with craft and governance literacy, able to maintain terraces, run filtration systems, and convene councils with credible authority. Collective routines proved durable. Festival proceeds funded maintenance, sensor readings posted in the plaza guided equitable rotations, and transparent ledgers reduced rumor. Children learned songs and sensor literacy together so future generations could steward land with reverence and skill. At the river, where a child once vowed, Isabella and Cale watched apprentices braid offerings into baskets and felt promises kept through labor fortify communal life rather than serve private ends. True. When visitors asked how reconciliation had been achieved, Isabella answered simply, "Listen, build tools people can manage, and defer to customs that hold memory." Cale added that accountability takes daily practice. Governance is a series of small routines that prevent power concentration. Together they described marriage less as a private contract, and more as a public pledge to protect livelihoods and shared futures. Years later, the community gathered to commemorate Mateo and to celebrate institutions that outlived individual. Apprentices performed terrace repairs publicly, elders led songs, and children demonstrated maintenance of filtration systems. The carved wooden horse sat in its small room, a talisman that taught stewardship through objects and store. Delegations from neighboring regions visited not for ceremonies but to learn protocols and then returned to adapt them locally. Their last public message urged action: support local governance, fund apprenticeships, amplify local voices, and prioritize sustained, modest engagement over spectacle. They invited audiences to participate concretely, subscribe for updates, join exchange programs, volunteer for skills where requested, and fund microgrants, administered by local councils. Their call emphasized steady involvement and mutual respect as the basis for lasting change. Join Isabella and Cale's journey, subscribe and share to inspire others with a love that defies time.